Avatar: The Last Airbender, The Promise. The beginning of the story is really boring because it repeats the intro of the show from each episode, when nobody reading this comic hasn't seen it. The only difference is it's in past tense. It reiterates that Aang defeated the Fire Lord in the show. If the purpose of this is to recap and tell people who don't know the stuff what happened, it's failing right here because it's not reminding us that defeated means deactivating its firebending forever. Usually defeated is code for killed. The narration says Aang's been talking to the Earth King about restoring harmony and discussing the existence of Fire Nation colonies. Why don't we see his face in this panel? Usually I won't mention art because anyone can see it, but I'm bored right now. And this is gonna happen a lot in these comics. He says the colonies are like a scar to the Earth people and regrets it because Zuko has a scar, which is a good moment reminding us that he's a good person. Zuko does so by not holding it against him when he used to be a hothead. He says he'll remove the colonies, and Aang says people's lives would be disrupted by that, so he should oversee it to ensure it goes peacefully. It's not doing anything to explain why people's lives would be disrupted. Why would it change their day-to-day lives that the colonies are switching governments? They're not saying they're deporting people. And he doesn't mean literally remove the colonies from the face of the earth. Aang could suggest anyone in his team other than himself to make sure it goes well. But instead he suggests himself out of arrogance when the only people who would be against this hate the Avatar. His friends volunteer to help him with this as I keep waiting for something to happen. The story repeats a scene from the end of the last episode out of necessity so that it can show us what happened right after Aang's kiss with Katara. I see the appeal in picking up right where the previous story left off. So it's a shame its only idea was ruining their moment with Sokka seeing them right away. Sokka complains selfishly because he's not used to her kissing in front of him. At least he's not mad at Aang. Nobody cares about their age difference in this scene because it's the 1800s. It's too bad I didn't say he's 13 now right before this, or remind me. Sokka says he came here to tell him they're about to take Appa for a ride for fun where they get to see fireworks with him up close. And they look really close to Appa. You'd think someone here would realize how dangerous this is. Toph complains that she doesn't appreciate fireworks because she's blind and startles Sokka. Katara hugs her, comforting her, and she agrees. Aang tries to get Zuko to cheer up, and he says he visited his father recently, and tells him that if he ever sees him turning into the previous Fire Lord, he wants him to promise to kill him. I don't know why he expects him to do that when he didn't even do that to his father. He should say this to any one of Aang's friends but him, who'd be just as capable of doing that. At first I never questioned this because on a meta level it makes sense because Aang's the main character and the second most important person in the world, and he's very important to him after their history. Zuko didn't need to say all of that boring dialogue before saying the throne comes with a lot of pressure. He reacts the way you'd expect and Katara nods, prompting him to make that promise. The story cuts ahead to a year later. Unless this goes back in time again, it kind of defeats the purpose of picking up right where we left off, because that seems like a more interesting time period than this. At least it seems like it is, because you'd think people would have gotten used to Zuko being the Fire Lord after a year. Instead, he wakes up in bed at night paranoid that someone's trying to kill him. He freaks out and gets reassured that he was moved to his safer place. A guard gets knocked out, and he's threatened by a chain wielder with a spike ball who's unlucky enough to miss. Nothing interesting happens in the fight after that, and Zuko throws a fireball she dodges before he grabs her and gets told that killing her would only continue his bad reputation among her family. She says to guilt him that her father is the mayor of the first of the Fire Nation colonies. She says that he's going to destroy her home by trying to remove the colonies. This is just confusing. She'd know he wouldn't literally destroy him because she's against him for thinking he's a weak leader, and there'd be no pragmatic reason to do so. And he wouldn't destroy the colonies by simply giving them back to the Earth King. And she'd know her life wouldn't be changed at all by that happening. She's just a fanatic who's exaggerating. She doesn't explain herself well enough. The next day, the assassin goes back to her father with tied hands, and Zuko tells him what happened. Surprisingly, he complains that he should have the whole place burned down, so he's not 100% pure good even now. But I guess the idea is that he doesn't mean this. He says the Harmony Restoration is for peace, and the mayor finally gets some courage after being afraid of him earlier. The mayor says his family lived on this land for generations, and so they have a right to be here. Zuko says Fire Nation citizens should be living in the Fire Nation. He's putting what the Earth Nation people want over what these people want. It makes sense for him to care more about a larger group of people over a smaller group of people, but now it makes perfect sense that people think he's betraying his own kind, because he really is with this. He's told Ozai wouldn't have made them feel like this, and this prompts him to visit his father. He finally points out banishing him set him on the right path, and wastes time before asking him where his mother is. Without threatening him with fire, I don't see why he expected him to tell him that, considering how spiteful he is. He taunts him, saying that maybe if he lets him advise him, he might feel like talking about his mother. So Zuko smartly says he doesn't need this because this guy can't be trusted. Ozai is the one who told him that the pressures of the throne can change someone. The story gets interesting again when Aang reveals to people on Appa that he's accompanied dozens of Fire Nation colonies on their way back to the Fire Nation who loved coming back. This happens to be the first time he's escorting people who don't appreciate it because they grew up in the Earth Kingdom. Aang tries to reassure him, revealing that of course Zuko is reintroducing classic Fire Nation culture. The Colonials get told to return home because Zuko withdrew his support for the movement, apparently by acting on another impulsive whim of his because of this guy. So he couldn't have waited until after he explained things to Aang before doing this. It turns out some people are freaking out over the safety of the town because of this, and their metal bending teacher Toph tells them to get back to practice. They annoy me constantly, and Toph hears Appa and decides to earthbend to fling herself onto him. Her friends hug her, and apparently they've been so constantly busy for the past year that they haven't had time to put aside to visit her academy for even a brief minute, somehow. She's told that Zuko's holed himself up with his soldiers and won't let anyone in or out for some reason. Sokka's rational enough to not assume the worst yet, and Aang talks to his previous life about how he's feeling. Roku in all this time hadn't thought enough to realize that even if he hadn't been indecisive, it wouldn't have made things better because Sozin's son was just like him anyways. Instead he assumes he could have prevented the 100-Year War like he didn't know Azulon at all, and thought he totally wouldn't have been mad at him for killing his father. There's no point in this scene. It's trying to create tension over the idea, would Aang keep his promise? But nobody with faith in the series is gonna buy that, because Zuko's a popular character. And we could have assumed he blamed himself for the war. It turns out people are protesting and look forward to Aang attacking his way to Zuko. Aang thankfully turns down the idea of causing damage to a gate unnecessarily, and he and Katara are sweet to each other in how they talk before he starts to fly with her next to him. And it's lampshaded by the characters that some people might be uncomfortable with how they're talking to each other, which makes this easier on some of the fans. They're told to leave by soldiers, and Aang's threatened with fire, and eventually some of his clothes get a bit of fire on them. So Katara does get to help him after all, putting out the fire and splashing the soldiers and freezing them. Eventually Zuko grabs Katara, lecturing her, and is mad enough to say that first she has to agree to stop attacking his people before he'd let her go. He doesn't humor Aang because of his pride, and that's a good point, and Aang blows him away because he's mad at him for Katara's sake. So they threaten each other with their bending, and Katara warns him that he might lose control of himself if he stays in the Avatar state, and convinces him to get out of it. Zuko admits Katara was right that they need to talk, and naturally Aang's annoyed because he should have said this right away. But it made sense that he didn't because it was very much like him to lose his temper and get caught up in his ego, and he had a good reason to think he was in the right. But if he hadn't holed himself up in a place, then they could have just talked in the first place. Zuko tells his friends how old this colony is, giving them a long speech when we already got it a lot earlier than this. Katara complains about an Earth Nation person shining the shoe of a Fire Nation person. She just jumps to the conclusion that most Earth Nation people here are poor, which makes sense because of her past grudge against the Fire Nation people. I know it's called Earth Kingdom, but tomato tomato. Zuko says it's not perfect, but everyone in the city is better off now than the people of the city a century ago when it was just a little village. Aang warns him that he's going to start another war with his decision. It flashes back to show us that when he was called a coward by the mayor, a wall of earth separated him from him, and he was shocked at seeing that his wife was an earthbender, who was smart enough to ask for forgiveness from him and say that she kept telling her husband off. It turns out the assassin is an earthbender too. Zuko is asked to stay in the city for a few days, which changed his mind, so he and Aang have a predictable argument. Even though Aang knew that getting rid of the colonies would disrupt people's lives, Katara looks around at the people here and says maybe this place should be an exception. Aang just thinks peace would be impossible if the oldest colonies were kept. Katara has a wise idea to say they should have another meeting with the king. It wasn't necessary for us to see a rocket thrown at Sokka and a racist remark, and I don't even get to see it impact him. It was worth it to see Toph stand up to them. One of them was dumb enough to somehow make fun of Sokka anyways, so I get to see him throw a boomerang at him. But again, I don't see the impact with him. The point of saying Aang come back was for there to be more tension established in the form of a time limit for Aang. But things were already a little tense. I'd rather have fast pacing that keeps me invested in the story the whole time. Eventually Aang thanks Katara and hugs her and tells off Sokka for complaining about how her relationship makes him uncomfortable. And she says she doesn't even know what that means. And Toph says she can explain, and the artist insists on having her demonstrate to gross her out. Anyways, back in the Fire Nation capital, which isn't given a name here, May complains that Zuko left without saying anything to her. It's almost like he's always been impulsive or something. He apologizes for being mean to her and says it won't happen again, making a promise he can't keep. May at least shows concern over his lack of sleep and impresses me because she's the one who hired the Kyoshi warriors to be his new security. They didn't make him feel any safer though. And I guess it's believable that he decided to take a walk without them because of that, and the fact that even with his previous bodyguards who didn't act any different than this, he still had to fight an assassin on his own and won. So whatever. He goes to Ozai bringing some tea and is desperate enough to request his advice in a moment of weakness. Aang and Katara enjoyed some affection with each other, and eventually Sokka for some reason pretends that Toph's idea for him to go with her was his idea when that wouldn't fool anyone. He at least tries to humor Aang and Katara by saying he's not going to leave just because of them. Toph jumps off Appa, and I get to see Sokka freaked out, and Toph creates a slide for them both. I also get to see Sokka have a rough landing. Why does Sokka ask her how she came up with the idea of being a teacher? Of course she'd be a teacher after she taught Aang. I guess he just said this so they'd have something to talk about. She has a bunch of predictable stuff to say, and then Sokka meets her students who are needlessly annoying in a sad attempt to be memorable for the audience in the wrong way. The students explain that they were kicked out by a new firebending dojo, who returned because Zuko withdrew his support for the movement, and they only left it because they had to because of his support. But isn't this illegal? Doesn't Toph own this place? The leader's annoying, and I get to see her scare him by proving metal bending exists. Sokka talks some sense into them, saying that if they start fighting, there won't be a building left to fight over. And it makes sense that they were too focused on how mad they were to think. He convinces them to have a duel where the most competent dojo keeps the building. Whichever team can force the member of the other to sit wins. So this scene is here to get the audience to not be on Zuko's side, when it was a complicated issue you could see both sides of before. I guess they thought the audience was siding with Zuko. And the duel's gonna happen in 3 days, giving Toph plenty of time to give her students training. I don't see the point of making the audience side with Toph instead of Zuko though. And the firebenders create even more tension, making Toph worried about her students failing, even though we already knew they were pathetic. I get to see Aang show compassion for Appa and how he talks to him. Aang plans to find a place to spend the night, and he gets praised by an Avatar fan club, with one of them having way too much to say. Katara doesn't appreciate this, even though it makes her boyfriend happy, and she should know he's not going to cheat on her. The fan club says they could stay at their clubhouse. One of them says they made it look like an air temple because most of their club members are girls. So it's using a sexist stereotype where girls are more likely to do this. But it is the 1800s. It's only confusing because it only seems like sexism exists in this world in the North Pole. Aang thanks the fan club for their efforts, and Ozai tells Zuko a story from his past, explaining that Zuko tried to save a weak animal from its predator, just to hesitate because he realized that he wasn't doing the right thing for the predator. Before he could reach a decision, a wave brought him to the ocean and Ozai saved him, despite not caring about his son for the entire show. Zuko says that all he wanted was to know how he was able to sleep peacefully in spite of the pressure. Because he doesn't care about anyone, duh. Didn't you already figure out that? Ozai doesn't feel like explaining why that old family memory is supposed to answer his question, and instead tells him to leave because he's a jerk and this is the only way he can get joy anymore. It was obvious what the memory was meant to be a metaphor for. He was telling him to be decisive or else. My time gets wasted seeing people somehow impossibly fail to metal bend, even though the only way it'd work is visualization and the proper movement, and visualization of that would be impossible not to do. So it has to be that they're doing the movements wrong. And you'd think Toph would instantly tell them exactly what they're doing wrong to make them start improving, but she doesn't. Toph explains that the reason she picked these as her students is that her metal bracelet moved near them when they got really emotional. And yet her doing everything in her power to get them super emotional still hasn't made them metal bend on purpose. It's not like Toph was metal bending without even trying when she got emotional earlier. She would have gotten emotional the second she was put in a metal cage. And yet her being emotional didn't cause the metal to start shaking just because of that. So you'd think this would imply that they're prodigies at metal bending, that they're natural even more than her. So we see panels showing her first encounter with each one of them. It would have been less boring if the art was in color. Sokka says this makes sense because Katara found out she was a waterbender because the ice cracked anytime he made her mad. But he doesn't proceed to say that she took forever to intentionally waterbend after that. Well, it serves a purpose to give us some tension over whether Dojo will win or not. I don't see the point in boring us wasting a million panels on it. I don't see the entertainment value in Sokka trying to teach them to try metal bending in a cringy, boring way. There would have already been tension over whether they would win or not, without somehow establishing that they've been complete failures, to make it look necessary to show us their training, when otherwise, we could have just had the next scene with them have them do the duel with the dojo. There would have been just as much tension over who would win otherwise, if any, because some people will just assume Toph will get what she wants because she's the main character. Sokka throws metal at them to make the metal bend out of fear, but they don't do what he wants, because they didn't have enough time to. He should have known to give them more time to prepare for this. If I were reading this casually, I'd skip most of the scenes in this subplot after this. It's bad enough it's boring too, but it's also frustrating. Good thing Aang's fan club is giving some levity to the arc. But the point of the scene isn't just to make Aang happy. It's also to have Katara be selfish and plan to make him feel bad for making way more people than just her happy. Oh no. So that's tedious too. Nothing that's happening in the scene actually matters to the plot. Katara at least says she hates to ruin his fun, even if that's a lie. She says they need to leave to meet with the Earth King. And Aang fortunately doesn't seem to realize she's mad despite her tone of voice and what she's saying. This would only make sense if he was just playing dumb to avoid confronting her. He makes it clear how much the fan club meant to him as the last Airbender and thanks her for letting him be there. And thankfully she feels guilty and says she doesn't deserve to be thanked. Good. She may not be perfect all the time before this either, but I'd still expect her to be a better person than that. He's had a crush on her the entire series. Why would you think that he'd leave her? Ozai gets visited by Zuko, who says that he unfortunately stayed up all night. He admits that he should have sided with the hawk because it was strong and noble and had earned its meal. Why would he say it was noble? It's just an animal. Otherwise he's right. He says he's already sided with the Fire Nation people, but he still can't sleep. Ozai eventually tells him that who he chooses to defend deserves defending simply because royalty chose to defend them. Zuko wastes time telling him he's wrong when of course at this point he's hopeless. Ozai doubts the Earth King would be reasonable and nice to the colonials. He tries to make Zuko think his army would attack them. Zuko keeps wasting his time saying he trusts Aang instead of simply leaving a little earlier. He wants to wait and says more often than not Aang's been right. Eventually Ozai tells him to leave and he again makes a fool of himself wasting time talking to him some more. But again, his mistake comes from an understandable place. It's from a hurt ego this time. Why didn't Toph get Sokka's idea to make her students super emotional with what gets to them a lot earlier? She had a long time to have this obvious idea. And it makes sense if one of them goes by the Dark One because his real name sucks, so he's compensating. Sokka gets the idea to tell Toph to make armor. I guess it makes sense that she didn't apply this old idea of hers to this in an entire year. Eventually you see the assassin Corey kiss Sneers, and eventually get mad at him because he was part of the protest. So we get to see some real karma against one of the protesters because he gets consequences for it. She asks him to choose between his friend and her. Then get to see the Earth King saying happily that it's been too long since he last talked to Aang. He thanks them and gets told about their idea to have a talk with Zuko. Sadly, Katara's too vague instead of simply explaining Zuko's side like a real person. There's some more boredom until eventually Sokka tells Toph's students a scary campfire story to get them scared enough to potentially metal bend. His plan was obvious to me right away, but he believably kept them from figuring it out by saying he brought them here for some bonding. He tells them about an evil spirit. You only need one panel for this. With the pacing of this, I'm surprised Toph showed up as early as she did. The Dark One instantly knows it's Toph because we're supposed to be smart, even though in a world with spirits in it, he has no reason to think it's Toph. Toph says his real name, and Sokka throws metal at them again because he somehow didn't learn from last time. Even though there's no reason they couldn't simply metal bend the armor. This is an idiot bowl. And Katara enjoys some food, and the king thanks them for giving him time to think, and proves Ozai right because he wants to restore his dignity and doesn't trust Zuko anymore. He plans to order his general to lead his troops to forcefully remove the colonials, and gets told that that's a declaration of war. You'd think his time spent living as a normal man would have taught him that Fire Nation people are people too. You'd think he would have wandered around colonies during that time and learned the same thing Zuko did. Did he only ever go around the Earth Kingdom? Why does Toph ask Sokka if he ever thinks about metal? She has to know he doesn't. She didn't need this as an excuse to remind him that when she learned metal bending, it was from pressure and pain. The same thing that makes metal. She says she was expecting her students to be something they're not. And conveniently they're listening to this right as they're about to run away. This guilts them as she compares herself to her parents. Katara plans to warn the colonists to evacuate, and someone was listening to them, even though she should be sleeping. Was she waiting here specifically for them to come here so they could be eavesdropped on? She tells the messenger bird to tell Aang's fans in Yu Dao that he needs help. The leader of the other dojo shows up wearing a silly hat, trying to make the story entertaining by being emotional, but I still hate him. Toph's prevented from sitting by a disc metal bending at her. So eventually her students prove themselves. And the only thing interesting here is that it's pointed out that they should stop firebending because they're just heating up the coins they're being hurt with. Maybe if I actually saw the discs impact these jerks, I would care more about what I'm seeing. Instead, the subplot was completely forgettable. The girl with a crush on Sokka finally gets over it conveniently. That was uncomfortable. Sokka compliments them as the other dojo leaves, and her students explain to her that she's the first person who believes that they could become more than what they are. It's cute that it's trying to be heartwarming with characters that are nothing but annoying. Maybe give them a redeeming quality like with all of the main characters. One that we don't just take for granted. Zuko makes some fire and admits that it's not him to imitate Ozai, which is a memorable, humorous moment. May confronts him because he didn't tell her he started meeting him with Ozai. He makes it unnecessarily sadder by saying that he loves her when I know that already, and she breaks up with him to punish him for being secretive. To be fair, why would he trust her to not freak out at him for visiting Ozai for advice? She's being selfish and unreasonable by expecting him not to keep that a secret. So she needed a different secret to really make this look justified. But this could have worked perfectly because she was mad at him in the show for not telling her something too. Suki blames herself for this because she told May to talk to him about Ozai. Zuko's told that the Kyoshi warriors are worried about him and is surprised that he sent spies to the Earth Kingdom, which warns him about what the Earth King is doing. It takes an unnecessarily long time before showing a war start. At least I see Zuko stand beside Aang and open up to him that he's wondering if he's right after all. I have to assume Aang's just imagining Ozai egging him on because of Zuko telling him off for keeping him alive, which he had to do to avoid a civil war. It's not like Zuko to hallucinate like he's Zula. He sees Ursa cry behind Roku even though she's still alive. Eventually turns out it was just a dream of both Zuko and Aang. What a huge coincidence! So now it makes sense. And there's still a point to the dream because it established that Zuko's doubting himself, so that the audience won't be too mad at him. I don't think that really mattered enough to justify a padding scene though. Aang warns the colonists to evacuate and stuff gets thrown at him that he has to dodge, when they could have just ignored him because he's a well-known pacifist. Cory the Assassin shows up with her friends and they explain that a lot of the people they love are Fire Nation people. Aang congratulates Sneers on getting a girlfriend. He's told that Sneers wants to keep both Earth Kingdom and Fire Nation intruders out. His girlfriend is being unreasonable by saying the city's both kingdoms because it's going to be impossible for the place to be administered by both kings at once. It's not like both kingdoms are run a certain way. Finally, Aang gets to warn them about the army. Then he gets greeted by another fan club, who got real tattoos, which offends Aang because he didn't earn them with actual airbending. Yeah, but she says they mastered the movements of it, so that should be good enough. He's mad about cultural appropriation, but considering that it's either this or no revival of his culture at all, because there's no airbenders left but him, he's being childish. He lampshades them doing this when they still studied his philosophy. Considering that info on the Air Nation culture was wiped out, the only reason they'd know anything about the Air Nation is if they learned it from him or someone he told about this. Aang plans on going to the city gates to buy people here some time, but he still wants the colonists to go despite what he was told because he's stuck on the idea that there has to be foreign nations out of sheer tradition. Zuko complains to apparently nobody. Aang's talk with Katara is a waste of time because it doesn't change his mind. Eventually Suki and Sokka kiss and he leaves in the balloon with her eventually. It's lampshaded that one of the students is even more annoying now. Pointing out your problems doesn't make them go away. I think the point was these students are supposed to be making you laugh all the time. But I don't see how they're anything but annoying. It's supposed to be cringy in a charming way, but it's the kind of humor that's completely unlike the Avatar series. Katara just had to take too long to tell Aang her point, so that he could tell her she's out of time to do so because the protesters are here. Katara gets rid of their sharp weapons and the battering ram is tanked. If he really headbutted it, he should have passed out. She wants him to keep the pieces from crushing people. And Aang saves someone who thanks him and feels bad about the fact that the protest was only a distraction to keep him from stopping a tank, because they were smart enough to know they were no match for him. If only awesome moments I love could be the norm in this arc. Even then, this isn't gonna amount to anything, so it's no wonder I didn't remember it. Eventually, Sokka wants Tom to get into one of the tanks undetected, and she creates an underground slide to get under Zuko's army. Sokka's scared by sliding, and Suki gets told not to complain about being unable to see around Toph. Thankfully, she just tells them to be quiet, and it tries for some more levity because someone complains that someone didn't stay away from bean sprouts when they were in the tank together. Well, that's not my kind of humor. It should have had a lot more joke to keep me engaged. Because you could say this isn't the place for a joke, but it made logical sense in universe. And I know it's not going to kill off any characters, so it's not going to be too dark. So why not have more jokes just because it's a story about tension? The heroes take over a tank. Suki wants to get to Zuko and says he seems lonely, and Toph says he's screwy in the head, which gives Sokka an idea. The fact that Sneers tells Smellerbee he's dating a Fire Nation person is all for nothing because there's a magic fight anyways. Aang sees the army and sees that his fan club covered up their tattoos badly instead of simply wearing hats like normal people would, because the story needed some levity. What do they think they'd be able to do to help him? The Earth King gets asked why he doesn't just announce his own decrees from the ground, so that's some karma. Toph reunites with her friends, and after a bunch of talking, Toph earthbands the tanks, but the fighting starts anyways. Katara grabs Aang when he's mad and keeps him from making a mistake, and goes away with him and explains that when she saw Corey's family, she also saw their future. Oh come on, why does it talk to Roku again? This was enough! He cares about Katara! I guess he wouldn't have dated her if it weren't for the fact that the air nomads are supposed to be nomadic, and so he would have argued with her over which country for them to settle in if they weren't traveling all the time. Aang says that if he breaks Airbender philosophy, it'll disappear, and gets told some good advice that the Avatar should care more about the world than its nation, or even family. He tells him Zuko is his descendant, which gets him more than the idea of Katara breaking up with him, apparently. Eventually, Katara tells her friends to disarm soldiers, and Toph makes a slide for Sokka. I always hated that the characters kept saying, "You're going out with you." It's completely forced and wasn't funny the first time. Sokka congratulates Smellerbee on getting a girlfriend, and eventually Toph's students go to help her. Katara goes up to the Earth King, who's regretting all this because he's scared, and he never visited this city. Katara says that to him, this place was always Fire Nation, and she takes him with her on an ice slide. And none of what's happening is plot relevant. As usual, the bending looks cool, and that's all I have to say about it. The ground breaks apart. Aang eventually flies up to Zuko, says that he's doing just what Ozai would have done, and he falls. But Aang saves him, and Katara hugs him. And Aang tells the Earth King that there's people from every nation here, and he's fighting against that. This convinced him just from looking at them. He doesn't even see Corey holding hands with Smellerbee, which would have gotten the point across better. For all he knows, they're strangers to each other. Aang tells Roku that when he was asked to think about the world, he thought about his friends, and admits that the world's different now, so he's better off without his advice. So rather than deciding not to talk to Roku again, he destroys the artifacts that let him talk to him again, because that's how magic works in this world. So he can't just consult a previous life whenever he wants. That'd be unrealistic. It was powerful imagery, so it's for the best. I have to assume the reason he outright destroyed the artifacts was in case he ever got tempted to talk to Roku again. Because otherwise he wouldn't think he has to do this. It's not like Roku forces his advice onto him. Because Zuko fainted, Iroh thanks Aang for bringing Zuko to him, and lampshades him not coming here sooner. There's no way he would have passed out for 4 days. Zuko says that Udao can't go back to being an Earth Kingdom city, and Aang says it has to be something new. That could annoy most of the people there since it's not choosing either nation, but it's the best option they've got. Zuko tells Aang he shared his dream and that he was relieved when Aang fulfilled this promise, and finally admits he was selfish to ask him for that. He has some great dialogue here. Zuko says that as soon as he fell, he trusted him to save him, and he says he's glad he did. So he didn't think it through when he trusted him to keep his promise. Otherwise, why did he ask him to make a promise he knew he wouldn't keep? Aang calls him his family, and Zuko says he merely thinks he saw his mother. Who else would it be? Iroh tries to add some more levity, saying that dreams can be the result of spicy food before bed, and Zuko says finding his mother would connect him to a better part of his family and give him peace. He says that realistically he sent tons of search parties after his mother for nothing. Because we need a whole story arc about him finding his mother. Because otherwise, most people would assume that this would be how he would find his mother. They could have had the arc about finding Zuko's mother be the first arc in the comic series. That would have made more sense. Because the show ended with him asking where his mother is. And he would have known this as soon as the show ended. Why would they have the first comic arc be based around something that the fans weren't interested in. Iroh lightens the mood again, serving them chewy tea that only he liked. Aang says he'll teach his fans the ways of the air nomads. They already learned. They said they spent months studying, but suddenly that counts for nothing because he wasn't teaching them. And I thought Zuko had an ego. So we get to see the point where they're finally called the Air Acolytes. I'm not sure why he got the idea to say acolytes because he never heard that word before as far as we know. Zuko talks for a while, justifying his decision to come to someone for help getting Ozai to tell him where his mother was. Predictably, he's talking to his sister, who says she'll be glad to help find her because not a day has gone by since he put her in the asylum that she hasn't wondered where her mother went. And just like in the show, her idea of a scary hallucination is her mother telling her she loves her instead of the opposite, even though she said it hurt that her mother thought of her as a monster. So which is it? I assume the idea is that she doesn't want to hear her say that because it implies that her mother was a good guy and she was the bad guy, making her wrong about hating her so much. This boring arc is about Zuko being in conflict over the fact that the Fire Nation people in old Fire Nation colonies are so integrated into their societies that it's clearly wrong to force them to leave. And even some Earth Kingdom people don't want them to leave. And yet Aang doesn't get convinced of this until the end of the arc because he's childish and being too traditional. And he'd rather there be 4 nations instead of a new one because he's the Avatar. Never mind the fact that the show had 2 Earth Kings. Why would they call their merely provincial leaders kings? This was written by Gene Yang. And the arc had an intriguing premise and theory by finally addressing this realistic consequence of the war. The story was great on paper, but it really goes to show how slow pacing alone can ruin my experience. I was bored for most of this because it's almost nothing but talking instead of things happening, and nearly every scene drags on far longer than it has to. And it's not even entertaining dialogue. Toph's subplot is the biggest example. It could have been cut and had her annoying students only show up when they were needed to be helpful, and the arc would have only been better off for it. This arc had plenty of great moments, but they can't be doing their job because all I ever remember about it is that there was nothing but dialogue and boredom with people not wanting to leave the colony. At least the arc usually makes sense, aside from Toph's metal benders taking forever to metal bend. There's a reason I'm only reviewing the arc as a whole, and it's because I have these same things to say about every issue of it. Not to mention the version of this I actually bought was the omnibus version containing 3 issues. The comics get much better after this one. It's okay for something to be mostly dialogue, but this is just mostly boring dialogue. It's not like the argument isn't interesting, but we get it after the first time people state their opinions.